I discovered that the West Yorkshire Archives were allowing access to people whilst COVID was ongoing. Because the libraries were shut down, we were able to access their ancestry programmes from home. So I took full advantage of that and set myself a deadline to research as many members of my family tree as possible. And hopefully by the time lockdown had ended and we all had access to libraries again, I would have gathered enough information meanwhile. So it's surprising how quickly you can obtain quite a lot of information, even if you're just starting from scratch. But everyone is able to speak to close relatives and have a good sense of who people are and what family tree strand to follow. So I had the main core of my family tree, and I was able to then gather some stories from individuals to embellish the information, which consisted mainly of births, deaths and marriage certificates, and that's all I really had to begin with, plus some generations going back on one strand of the family tree. The other strands of the family tree were pretty non-existent, and hardly any stories surrounding the people. Some family members barely knew their names, had no idea how many brothers or sisters they had. So in some sense I was starting from scratch, with some snippets of conversations and stories that had been remembered by relatives who were still alive, that I was able to go on. So I do recommend at first doing a full overview of your family tree and making as many notes as possible of the names that you're aware of. And then you will find that there's some people along the way who are quite interesting and stand out to you for certain reasons. And those are the people that you can then delve a bit deeper and perhaps spend a whole day, in some cases, just researching one particular person, and obtaining some more documents and photographs if possible. So in my family tree I thought that the main core of the family tree were all from Wales. So I'm Welsh, but I live in Yorkshire. So I was interested in looking at other family tree members and where they were from and how they'd got to end up in Wales or elsewhere. And I found another strand of the tree, and the family came from Sheffield, so that was really interesting, and finding out how they ended up in Cardiff. And then another family tree strand, they were actually from Ireland, and that was really interesting, and I still don't know how or why they came across to Cardiff specifically, but it's enabled me through some historic event research to unpick a few details and myths. And then one of my ancestors, I've discovered, she travelled from Cardiff all the way to Australia. So it's been really interesting to see how some family members have consistently stayed in the same street or even the same house for years, and to the other extreme there's some real kind of journeys that have taken place, and it's been really interesting looking at the documents online, particularly the census documents have been really helpful to actually enable me to go on Google Street View and track down the areas where my family lived. And again, I've been able to kind of unpick some stories and dispel some myths as a result of Google Street View. I've also learned a lot about the documents that I've read, some beautiful handwriting in italic pen, and that stood out to me because when I was at primary school, the teachers all taught us to actually handwrite in italic using italic pens. So I found a real connection with just looking at all the beautiful documents, incredibly neat handwriting. And also I found that there were a lot of brothers and sisters in the family. So going through the generations, there were a lot of children compared to current family today, and how we normally perhaps would expect, say, 2 or 3 children. Going back through the generations, sort of easily 8 children would be the norm. And interesting with the census and the women, it's ream upon ream of the words unpaid domestic duties, and I found that really a bit sad in a way. And a lot of my family, the husband, they've been kind of labourers and workmen, so very manual labour jobs. But one family tree, we kind of suspected that there were a lot of people who were perhaps more down the kind of media, humanities and art and design route. And there were writers, journalists, stonemasons, and to my surprise and delight, one of my family members, going back, way back, she was a widow, but she was named in the census as being an interior designer. So I found that really fascinating, and I could relate to that, having a background of art and design myself. So it was really interesting to kind of make the connection with one strand of the family tree, which I really didn't know much about at all. The family that travelled from Ireland, that was really interesting, the husband and wife, to see where they lived in Ireland. So I tracked their routes on the Google Street View, and around the time wondered how they actually travelled and how they even met, because it was quite a distance between the 2 members. And then for them also to kind of come across to Cardiff, that really got me thinking. And there was all myths about the Irish potato famine, so it was really interesting to look into the history of Ireland, and perhaps unpick how or why they travelled to Cardiff. It wasn't the same year as the potato famine, so that possibly wasn't a factor in the reasons why they travelled across. And we may never fully know the reasons, but this is where it becomes even more interesting, really, because if you kind of start digging a little bit deeper, you can find out some hidden gems. One of my ancestors, who I did know about, died in the Battle of the Dardanelles, and I've recently received a photograph of the ship that he was on, and also a photograph of the medals that my ancestor obtained, and I knew nothing about those. So that's an absolute piece of treasure to find someone in the family who's looked after those medals, and I've got all sorts of documents, and I also have a photograph of that family member who was sadly killed in the Dardanelles, but I never related the two, didn't quite know who the person in the photograph was. So if you've got any photographs, they can be absolutely fascinating just to look at, to identify the year, and look at the clothes they're wearing and who they're with in the family portrait, and why it was taken, perhaps a special event, occasion. So just through one photograph and one document, you can obtain so much information about that one person. I was warned before researching the family tree that I might bring up some skeletons from the closet, I haven't found anything too horrendous. Apparently one family member was born out of wedlock. There's a lot of secrets in families. I'm sure everyone has them. Perhaps today in the 21st century we don't see those secrets as being quite as horrific as perhaps they did back then. So I would encourage you to unearth those secrets, because they're perhaps not as bad as you think. I would also encourage people to research their family tree from an early age. I think it tends to be the perception that retired people look into their family tree at that point. It's a bit unfortunate, because you may discover that somebody was still alive and well, but it's not until it's too late perhaps that you discover that you're no longer able to speak to them for whatever reason. So I do encourage an early start, and which is a great way of adding to your family tree in the present day as well. So you can engage with photography, you can engage with recording interviews with your family members, and I think that's an absolutely fascinating thing to do. I've recently discovered an old audio tape which I barely remember making with my family in the early 70s, and I'm going to dig that out and listen to it. And digitise the audio cassette. So these are a way of ongoing research, and it can be fun to do. There are some family myths, or Chinese whispers, if you like to call them, so stories that get told over the years, but perhaps some misinformation or misremembering certain aspects. So one of my family, my great-grandfather, it was always said that he was a stenographer in the courts, so taking down the shorthand, typing it up. But when I researched and found a few documents, he was actually not a stenographer, but he was a compositor. So he arranged the type in a newspaper, so the type layout for the articles to be printed off the newspapers, and that made a lot more sense, because his son, my grandfather, he was a reporter for the newspaper. So these little stories start to link together, but only as a result of finding the factual evidence in the documents. There's also another myth regarding one of my ancestors being Lady Pembroke. This does not appear to be true. However, when I've delved into the story of who she might be, there were strands of my family who lived in Pembrokeshire, and they worked on a farm, and they had lots of horses, and my family members were blacksmiths, and so there may be a bit of misinformation, misinterpretation over the years. So I don't think I'm related to Lady Pembroke, but it's been really fascinating to see how that story has kind of changed and evolved. And so I'd encourage you to kind of track down your family myths and debust them. And I think ultimately, the ultimate goal is perhaps a family reunion. I think that would be fascinating, to get everyone to travel to the place, which is easy to get to for everyone, hopefully, and they can all bring their documents and photographs and stories with them to share. And so that really would help to kind of, pull all the information together, and that's an achievement in itself. But meanwhile, it's an absolutely fascinating, ongoing work in progress. There's all sorts of stories and strands and people that stand out to me. There's somebody who got married really late, and then she was only married a few years before her husband passed away from cancer, and then she died just a couple of months later, and she was only 36. So there's something really interesting there that I want to find out a bit more about. There's a very sad story about a lady who committed suicide with the gas cooker, and she had a new husband and a young child. But equally there's some other really nice stories. There's a lady who had 4 children with her husband. They were all file cutters, working in Sheffield Steel, making the cutlery. And her husband passed away, I don't know how, possibly an accident at the factory or some other reason. And 4 years later, it looks like she fell in love with his brother and went on to marry him and have another 4 children. And I only really found that information out just from one document, where a name was crossed out and another name was put in its place, and I found that really odd. So there are little stories and little bits of information that you can find out just from one sheet of paper.